Wyoming Territory, 1882, the wind howled low through the sagebrush as the stagecoach creaked its way into the dry, boned town of Hollow Creek, trailing dust like smoke. Clara Zeller sat on the edge of the cracked leather seat inside, her fingers clenched tight around a stitched cloth bag resting in her lap. She was 23, too thin from months of train rides and skipped meals, too quiet for most folks to notice, and too different everyone always said so. The man who had ordered her, sight unseen, had made it plain in his letters. I want a strong wife, wide in the hips, able to bear children and keep a house. No sickly types. But Clara had nowhere else to go. The coach stopped in front of the post office, and Clara stepped down into the dirt. Her boots slipped in the dust, but she caught herself on the rail. A man waited nearby, clean-shaven with a red vest and shiny boots. He looked her up and down once, then frowned. "You Clara Zeller," she nodded. Her throat tightened. He squinted. "You look different than I expected." "I came like you asked," she said, voice soft but steady. The man, Mr. Wallace Granger, shook his head. "You're too thin, pale. You look like you might faint if the wind blew hard. I can do the work." "I changed my mind." He turned on his heel, walked off down the street, and left her standing there with the bag still clutched to her chest. Clara did not cry. She stood where he left her until the stage driver tugged her sleeve and pointed to the bench alongside the hitching post. "Better sit, miss," he said kindly. "You look about ready to drop." She sat and breathed. The sun was strong, the sky too wide, and her chest ached. The bench creaked again. A man had taken the seat beside her. Dust clung to his shirt and his hat was pulled low, but his voice was warm when he spoke. "He does not know what he lost." Clara blinked and turned. The man looked young, perhaps 30, maybe less. Tanned from sun, lean but solid, with eyes the color of river mud after rain. "You do not know me," she said. "Name is Elias Park," he said. "I run cattle north of here, saw the whole thing." She gripped her bag tighter. He was right, I am not what he wanted. "Maybe," Elias said, leaning back. "Or maybe he was just not what you needed." They sat in quiet. "You have people?" he asked. "No. Husband, children?" "No." "Then come with me." Clara tensed. "I do not mean anything improper," Elias said quickly. "I have a spare room in the house. You can rest, eat something. Think about what you want to do next. That is all." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because you look like you have not been cared for in a long time," he said, standing, "and everyone deserves better than what you just got." Clara followed him. It was a long ride north, past the dry hills, into land dusted with green and lined with cottonwoods. Elias's place sat near a low creek, house simple but tidy, with smoke curling from the chimney. He helped her down from the horse like she was made of glass. Inside, he handed her a bowl of stew, then left the room so she could eat alone. Clara took the first bite and swallowed hard. It had been 2 days since her last real meal. That night, he gave her the spare room. She lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. In the morning, Elias was already out with the horses. She found a clean dress folded on the table with a note. "Thought this might fit. You can help if you want. No pressure." Clara dressed, rolled up her sleeves, and walked out into the sun. From that day on, she helped. She fed the hens, gathered eggs, swept the floors, mended his shirts. Elias never asked, never expected, but always thanked her with a nod or a smile. He worked long hours, but each evening they sat together under the porch roof, drinking coffee while the sun dipped low. Sometimes he talked about the land he bought with a soldier's pay, about how his parents died in Missouri during the war, about how he did not need much, just quiet and honest work. Sometimes she talked too, not much, but enough for him to listen. "I used to draw," she said once. "Before everything." "Do you still?" She shook her head. "No paper, no pencils." The next morning, a bundle of sketch paper and graphite sticks waited on the table. Clara stared at them for a long time, then she picked one up. Weeks passed. One afternoon, Elias came in from the barn, his shirt soaked through with sweat. He paused when he saw her sitting at the table, sketching. "I hope you do not mind," she said. He stepped closer. The page showed a pencil drawing of the land behind the barn fence posts, the low creek, the cottonwoods. "It is beautiful," he said quietly. "I used to think I had to be someone else to be wanted," she whispered. "But out here, with you, I do not feel wrong anymore." Elias reached down, touched her hand. "You were never wrong, Clara." She looked up at him. That night they sat closer on the porch, their arms touched. He did not move away, neither did she. The next day, rain fell for the first time in weeks. They stood under the porch roof, watching the drops hit the dirt. "I never thought I would feel safe," Clara said. "I never thought I would want someone again," Elias answered. He looked at her, long and quiet. She looked back, then he kissed her. It was not rushed, it was not forced. It was the kind of kiss that says, "You matter," the kind that opens something inside you that had been shut tight for too long. When he pulled back, her eyes were wet. "So am I still too different?" she asked, voice soft. Elias smiled. "You are perfect the way you are." And for the first time in her life, Clara believed it. The creek had thickened with summer's melt, and the cottonwoods whispered above it, their leaves curled silver in the wind. Clara stood near the edge, skirts gathered in one hand, the other steadying her sketchboard. Her eyes moved slow across the waterline, measuring shadow and shape. Behind her, the horses shifted in the corral, their hooves soft in the dirt. Elias had been gone since dawn, riding out to check on a calf that hadn't taken to nursing. He'd left without fuss, just a quiet nod and a hand brushed gently along her back as he passed. She still felt the memory of that touch hours later. Not for the warmth of it, though that lingered, but for what it had meant. He didn't ask her to keep house or stay useful. He simply wanted her near. She had just begun to draw the twist of a willow branch when she heard hooves crunch dry grass behind her. Turning, she caught sight of a wagon rolling up the narrow path, a woman at the reins, her bonnet shadowing a sharp-lined face. A boy rode beside her, maybe 12 or so, bare-legged and sun-browned. Elias trailed behind them on horseback, his shirt damp down the back, a rope looped around the saddle horn. Clara set down her board and walked toward the house, wiping her palms against her skirt. She met Elias near the porch steps, his brows lifted with something between apology and quiet hope. "This is Ruth Lark," he said. "Neighbor from east of the ridge. Her boy found a stray calf tangled up in their fence, figured it might be mine." Ruth slid down from the wagon and looked Clara over, not unkindly, just direct. "You're the one Elias took in after the stage came through." Clara nodded, wondering what people had said. "Well," Ruth said, glancing toward the barn, "he's not usually one to keep company. Must be something in you worth the keeping. I'm just trying to help where I can." Ruth snorted softly and headed toward the barn without another word. Her son hesitated, then followed, dragging a length of rope. Elias leaned against the porch rail, watching Clara with a quietness that had grown between them like evening light, slow and certain. "She's blunt," he said. "I like her," Clara answered. "She says what she means." Elias looked at her, then not like someone trying to decide what to make of her, the way everyone else had done, but like he already knew and liked what he saw. Later, after Ruth and her boy left with a sack of dried cornmeal and Elias's thanks, the two of them sat near the corral, watching the returned calf wobble after its mother. The fence creaked behind them, and crickets had begun their steady hum. Elias rested his arms on his knees. "I didn't used to think about what it'd be like to have someone here. I figured quiet was enough." Clara traced a line in the dirt with the toe of her boot. "And now I can't walk in from the barn without wondering if you've drawn something new, or if you're out by the cottonwoods again. I listen for your footsteps." The honesty in it loosened something deep inside her. She didn't speak right away. When she did, it was soft but sure. "I never thought a man would see me like that, not after all the places I've been turned from." Elias reached out, not fast, not bold, just steady. He took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles like he was learning every part of her. She let him. "I don't want you here just because you've nowhere else to go. I want to stay because it's the first place I've ever felt like I belong." They sat like that as the sun pulled long shadows across the grass. The air cooled, and the night birds began their low, whistling cries from the trees. Elias didn't let go of her hand, and she didn't pull away. The next morning, Clara rose early before the hens stirred. She lit the stove, set water to boil, then stepped outside and walked toward the barn. Inside, the damp smell of hay and leather filled the air. She found Elias brushing down his gelding, his sleeves rolled, his jaw dark with stubble. I want to learn to ride, she said. He paused, brush still in hand. You sure? I want to know the land the way you do. I want to carry my own weight. Elias studied her face. That's not why I need you. I know, she said. But it's why I need me. He set the brush down. All right then, we'll start with Bluebell. She's steady. By mid-morning, Clara sat awkwardly atop the mare, hands loose on the reins. Elias walked beside her, one hand on the saddle, guiding her through the open field behind the barn. She wobbled once, laughed real and full, and caught his eye. You all right? He called up. I'm better than all right. He smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. Then you're doing just fine. And she was. The wind had shifted north, bringing with it the smell of pine and something sharper change, maybe. Clara sat on the porch steps, her skirts tucked beneath her, a mug of chicory coffee cooling in her hands. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, but morning had begun its slow unfurling across the plains. Bootsteps moved behind her, measured and unhurried. Elias stepped down beside her, carrying a folded newspaper, the kind they got once every couple weeks from Casper when the peddler passed through. Town councils arguing over whether to build a second schoolhouse. Too many children crammed into one room, he said, sitting beside her. There's talk of bringing someone new out to teach. Clara looked out toward the pasture, where Bluebell and the others stood calm in the pale light. I never made it past lessons in a church basement. We moved too often. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, if you wanted to go back to learning, I could ask Ruth to lend some books. She's got more than sense, I think. Clara turned her mug in her hands. Would you think less of me if I couldn't read well? He met her eyes. No, Clara, I'd think more of you for wanting to learn. She nodded slowly. Then maybe I'll ask. They spent the rest of the morning repairing the chicken coop after one of the posts had gone soft and leaned in with the last rain. Clara held the boards steady while Elias hammered, the rhythm of it a kind of music between them. She didn't flinch now when the hammer struck. Her hands were rougher than they'd been, stronger too. Afterward, she gathered the eggs and brought them inside to wash. Elias stayed outside, tying up a loose rail on the corral fence. When she stepped back onto the porch, she caught him standing still, staring out across the field. His shoulders were tense, jaw fixed. She followed his gaze and saw two riders coming up from the southern trail. Dust rose behind them and their coats were stiff with trail dirt. Clara stepped down beside him. Know them? She asked. Not yet, Elias said, voice low. But they're headed straight for the house. The riders slowed as they neared. One was older, with a face like dried bark and a revolver worn low on his hip. The other was younger, with a long scar slicing across his cheek. They stopped a few yards from the porch. Morning, the older one called. Name's Jessup. My brother and I are looking for a red calf, might have drifted up this way. She's here, Elias said. Got tangled in my neighbor's fence. We brought her back 2 days ago. Jessup tipped his hat. Mind if we see her? Elias didn't move. You run cattle out this far? Jessup's mouth twisted. Started running them 2 months back. Got a claim east of the bluffs. There's no registered brand on that calf, Elias said. Jessup smiled without warmth. We don't hold to brands. Trust our herd to stay loyal. That's not the way it works here. The younger brother shifted in the saddle, eyes fixed on Clara. You his wife? He asked. Clara didn't answer. Elias stepped forward. She's mine. You'll speak with respect. The younger man's gaze lingered another second, then dropped. Jessup gave a nod, turned his horse. We'll come back with papers if that's what it takes. You do that, Elias said. The brothers rode off, slow and easy, but Clara didn't breathe until they were out of sight. You think they'll come back? She asked. Elias touched the brim of his hat. They were looking for more than a calf. Clara stared at the trail. I don't like the way he looked at me. Elias's voice was steady. You won't see him alone. Not ever. Later that day, Ruth came by with her boy and a sack of dried apples. Clara told her what happened, brief and without drama. Ruth nodded once, set the apples down on the table. I'll keep watch with my rifle if need be, she said. Those two been stirring near my land as well. Clara followed Ruth outside while the men checked the cattle. They stood near the fence line, sun warm on their shoulders. I never thought I'd feel like someone would stand up for me, Clara said. Not like that. Ruth's gaze softened. Elias isn't one to waste words, but when he says you're his, that means something. Clara looked toward the barn where Elias was lifting a rail back into place. I want to be worthy of that. You already are, girl. Just keep living like you belong. That's all it takes. That night, Elias cooked. Clara sat at the table, watching him pour cornmeal batter into a hot skillet. He worked without comment, sleeves rolled, forearms streaked with flour. When he turned, he caught her watching. You do that a lot, he said. What? Look at me like you're figuring something out. She smiled faintly. I am. He set the skillet aside and leaned on the table, eyes meeting hers. What have you figured so far? That I want this, she said. Whatever this is becoming. He reached for her hand across the table. It's becoming home, Clara, if that's what you want. She threaded her fingers through his. It is. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, the silence between them filled with something steady and sure. The kind of quiet that didn't mean emptiness but belonging. By late August, the soil along the creek had hardened to a cracked skin, and the cottonwoods stood still, their leaves dulled to a tired green. Mornings came with a dry hush, and the air held a weight that made every movement slower, more considered. Clara stood in the garden Elias had planted long before she arrived. The squash vines had grown thick, curling around stakes and spilling over the edges of the bed. She knelt to inspect them, fingers brushing along the underside of a leaf where beetles liked to nest. The sun had only just crested the ridge, but sweat already clung at the back of her neck. Behind her, Elias's voice broke the quiet. You see the tracks by the fence this morning, she rose, brushing dirt from her hands. Were they cattle? Boots. 2 pairs came close to the barn but didn't cross the yard. She met his eyes. They're watching. Maybe they can't decide if it's worth it. Clara folded her arms. You going to town today? Need to. We're low on salt and lamp oil. Thought I'd check the smithy too. I'll come, he hesitated. You sure? I want to be seen beside you. They rode out after the midday meal, Clara behind Elias on Bluebell, the sun pressing down hard as they followed the narrow path toward Hollow Creek. The town hadn't changed in the week since she'd first stepped off the stage. Same dust, same sagging storefronts, same tired horses tied along the posts, but it looked different now with Elias beside her. They stopped outside the mercantile. Clara slid down, smoothing her skirt. A man with a crooked nose and a silver watch chain stepped out from the store's shadow, tipping his hat to Elias. Been hearing talk, he said. Some folks say you've taken up with a girl who turned up alone. Elias reached past Clara to open the door. She's not gossip. She's my partner. Inside, the dry scent of flour sacks and cedar shelves wrapped around them like memory. Clara walked ahead, picking out the items they needed. When she brought them to the counter, the shopkeeper watched her hands as if expecting them to tremble. They didn't. You'll be at the harvest gathering, he asked Elias, likely. Bring her. Folks ought to know her better. Outside, Elias loaded the supplies into the saddlebag. I didn't know there'd be a gathering, Clara said, annual thing. They hold it at the river bend just after the first frost hits. Music, dancing, food, brings in folks from 5 directions. She glanced toward the west, where the sky had begun to darken faintly at the edges. I'd like to go, he nodded once. Then we'll go. They rode home slow, the silence between them easy. When they reached the house, Ruth's wagon sat near the barn. Her boy stood on the porch, holding a wrapped bundle with twine around the middle. He handed it to Clara without a word and ran off to help Elias with the horses. Ruth stepped out from the kitchen. I brought you something, she said. Found an old primer and a few readers my girl left behind when she married out east. Clara unwrapped the bundle. The first book had worn corners and a faint ink stain on the cover. I'll try not to ruin them. They've already seen worse. They sat on the porch as the sun dropped. Ruth read a passage aloud slowly, tracing the words with her finger. Clara repeated after her, stumbling only once. When she finished, Ruth shut the book. You've got a sharp mind. Don't let anyone tell you different. After Ruth left, Elias found Clara in the kitchen, her hands buried in flour. She was shaping the dough into small rounds, her brows drawn in focus. You're learning to read. I want to be able to write you something someday, if you're ever gone longer than a day. He stepped behind her, resting his hands lightly on her hips. I'd keep every word. She turned to face him. Even the ones I spell wrong, especially those, they'd be yours. They stood close, the fire in the stove crackling behind them, the dough forgotten for a moment. Clara reached up, brushing her fingers along the edge of his collar. I thought I'd have to make myself smaller to be accepted, but I was only ever looking for the wrong eyes. Elias leaned in, his voice low. You fit here, Clara, not because you changed. Because you stayed true. She kissed him, then not the first time, and not hurried but with a certainty that had taken root and grown into something quiet and strong. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping leaves across the porch. Inside, they moved together through the dim kitchen light, Flour still dusting her hands, the smell of warm bread rising behind them. The first frost came soft, silvering the edges of the grass and leaving the morning breath of the horses thick in the air. Clara wrapped her shawl tight as she stepped outside, the wood bucket in her arms. The cold bit tender at her cheeks, but it didn't settle inside like it used to. Elias was near the fence line, checking the latch on the south gate. He lifted his head when she approached, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. "Frost'll hold," he said. "We'll head to the river bend after breakfast." Ruth and her boy plan on coming along. Clara set the bucket down and looked past him, toward the quiet stretch of land that rolled out toward the horizon. "I haven't danced since I was a girl," she said. "Not since my mother's sister took us in for a winter and we went to a Christmas gathering in a church basement." He stepped toward her, brushing a curl from her temple with the back of his knuckles. "If you don't want to, we can keep to the edge. Just watch the fire and listen." "I want to," she said. "With you." By mid-morning, the wagon was hitched and packed with a basket of boiled eggs, slices of salt pork, and a square of apple preserve wrapped in cloth. Clara had sewn her dress from muslin Ruth gave her, plain blue with a narrow collar and 2 buttons she'd salvaged from Elias's old work shirt. She'd stitched the cuffs by hand, slow and neat. Elias didn't speak when he saw her step out of the house, but his gaze lingered, and his mouth pressed into a line of quiet appreciation. At the river bend, the gathering had spilled out across the field. Smoke curled from a half-dug pit where men turned slabs of meat with long forks, while children chased each other between hay bales. A fiddler tuned his strings near the wagon circle, and the scent of firewood and roasted onion hung thick in the cold air. Ruth waved them over, her boy already off with the others. She handed Clara a small tin cup filled with cider. "Don't let them talk you into the pie contest," she said. "Last year, the preacher's wife cried when she lost to a woman who used lard instead of butter." Clara laughed, the sound catching her by surprise. "I didn't bring anything but eggs. Then you're safe." Elias stepped away to speak with a neighbor, and Clara wandered toward the music. A woman she didn't know offered her a seat near the fire, and for the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, Clara didn't feel like someone on the outside of things. Her name passed from one mouth to another, and the looks she received were no longer curious, but warm. When the music started, Elias found her again. He held out his hand, not asking, just offering. She placed hers in his without hesitation. They moved slow at first, her steps unsure, his steady. He didn't lead with force but with presence, like the rhythm already lived inside her, and he was just waiting for her to find it. The fiddler played something sweet and low, and the ground beneath their feet felt sure. "I don't know the steps," she said softly. "You're already doing it." As the sun dipped, lanterns were lit and hung from tree branches, the light casting a soft glow over the crowd. Clara didn't count how many dances they shared. She only knew that her feet never ached and her hand never left his. Later, they sat near the fire, sharing the last of the preserved apple between them. Elias leaned close, his voice low so only she could hear. "You still think about leaving?" She shook her head. "No, I think about planting beans in the spring. I think about building a shelf for the books Ruth gave me. I think about names." He turned to her. "Names?" She met his eyes. "If we were to have a child, I'd want a name that means something." Elias was still for a long moment, then he reached for her hand. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like everything." The ride home was quiet. Ruth's boy had fallen asleep in the back of their wagon, and the stars had begun to scatter across the sky like spilled flour. Elias reached across the seat and took Clara's hand, their fingers laced between the reins. That winter, Clara painted the walls of the front room with pale blue milk paint. She read aloud from Ruth's books in the evenings, her voice growing more confident with each chapter. Elias built her a shelf, and they filled it together. The land froze hard, but the house never felt cold. By spring, the creek ran full again, and the hens laid more than they could eat. Clara planted beans in neat rows, her belly rounding beneath her apron. She moved slower, but still did the work she loved, her hands in the soil, her heart steady. One morning, she found Elias fixing the gate that swung crooked in the wind. She leaned on the post, watching him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking I'd like to sit with you on this porch when our hair is gray and the pasture's quiet. I'm thinking I'd like our child to grow up knowing what it feels like to be seen." Elias straightened, came to stand beside her. "Then that's what we'll give them." Years passed. The house grew fuller with books, with sketches Clara pinned above the hearth, with the laughter of a girl who had Elias's eyes in Clara's quiet way. Her name was Liddy, after Clara's mother. On warm evenings, they sat beneath the cottonwoods, their chairs side by side, Liddy asleep inside, the dog curled beneath their feet. The porch creaked in the breeze, and the stars came out slow. Elias reached for Clara's hand, just as he always had, and she gave it, just as she always would. And they stayed that way, rooted, whole, and together.